Okay. Okay, hello. I'm Chris Ott, and I'm continuing with this series on what Mayor Baba really taught. Now, just reviewing that when I began this series and was explaining what I was going to do, I said that it would go on, and I would cover everything. And that might be the case. I'm not sure. I could end at any point because I've covered the main points that I wanted to. And I did threaten to come back and redo them. But as I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure I have to. I think that they communicate well enough. And so I'm not sure what I'm going to do. But anyway, this is part 16 of that series. And the topic here is on Mayor Baba on good and evil. And I think this is going to be an interesting talk. I hope so. So let me continue. And as I said, I've already covered the main points that I had in mind when I began. But as I think about it in between these, things come to mind that I noticed. I've always noticed, people had a little wrong, or I had it a little wrong. And I went back and reviewed. And in this case, I too was not that good on this because I had also picked up things from just hearsay, which I thought Baba said. And that's something important to cover in this. So when Christians that I've talked to have appraised Mayor Baba's teaching from what they've looked at, they say, well, Mayor Baba didn't have evil. He didn't teach that there's any evil, that there's just degrees of good and everything's good. So nobody has any idea of right and wrong. And that's why Baba lovers get divorced a lot and things like that. I've heard that. And it's just that Baba didn't make a good and evil distinction. Well, I kind of thought that was the case. And my father told me some things like that. And I've heard these over the years, but I've never really gone and spent the time to look it up and see. So, first of all, the thing that I kept hearing was that Baba said there is no evil, there's only degrees of good. And I raised my daughter like that. And sadly, when we talked about this before this talk, she was a little kind of like, well, you told me this over and over since I was a kid, so you better get it right, because I apparently got it wrong. Okay, so there's this expression that is attributed to Baba, and it is, there is no evil. It's sort of meme on the internet is this quote. There is no such thing as evil. There are only relative degrees of good. Mayor Baba. And you see it over and over and over, duplicated, like a little block. And they allow you to embed it into something because people like this. It's popular, especially if you don't want to, you want to believe that if you've got ghosts in your closet and you don't want to think about it, it'd be very nice if there's no such thing as evil. That's just a human construct. And that's actually become a modern meme, is that, morality is a human construct. There's some truth to that. And Baba gives a very sophisticated discourse that rides that fine line, okay? And I think he does a superb job. And I'm going to get into this up. This will probably be a two-part video that I'll stitch together and make it about an hour, because I don't think I can cover this whole thing in 25 minutes or so. Okay, so what is the line? Matter of fact, Mayor Baba's not the only one who's quoted as saying there's no such thing as evil. So the line they repeat over and over is there's no such thing as evil. There are only relative degrees of good. Well, the first thing that should jump out is that there's a grammar problem. relative degrees there's a redundancy. I mean, there's a spectrum of good, or you could say there are degrees of good, but relative degrees is kind of redundant. It's poor grammar. And Baba, even if he, maybe you could say English was his second language or whatever, but Baba was actually, his major in college was English literature. And he was a poet in several languages, including English. And his followers went over everything with a fine-tooth comb. And Baba's discourses, by the way, were written from his notes. So they're worked out grammatically, and sort of the logic of how it's written is worked out by his disciple, Dr. Deshmukh, who had his PhD in philosophy from the University of London. So, and he was a teacher of philosophy. So that's, you wouldn't find a lot of crummy English in a book by Deshmukh originally. And it's been gone over many times, and they've picked it with a fine-tooth comb to find it. So that's already a sort of a red flag. So what I did is I took the term degrees of good, and I put it in a search. Now you can do this on a Macintosh, and there's a way you can do it on a PC, but I'm not sure how you do that. But in a Mac, it's not difficult. If you take all PDF files, and they don't all have to be PDF files, they can be Word files. You take files and you put them in a folder, and then you search the folder for a phrase, and you put it in quotes. So I have a folder with everything Meher Baba ever wrote that we know about, for the most part. And so I can search and see if he ever used a phrase. And it only came up, that term, degrees of good, only came up one time. And it came up in a biography of Meher Baba, written by Baba's disciple, Charles Purdom, an English literary critic, and who wrote several biographies of Baba, and also an early version of the Discourses, in fact. And Charles Purdom, he wrote the book The God-Man. Full title is The God-Man, The Life, Journey, and Work of Meher Baba with an Interpretation of His Silence and Spiritual Teaching. And it was originally published in 1964, and I have a very ratty old edition printed in 1971, right here in Myrtle Beach, in fact. Okay, so what does it say? Where does this come from? There's no such thing as evil. It comes from an interview. The interview was during a tour that Baba was making in 1932. And this is one of the first encounters of Baba with the West. And he's being interviewed by a reporter. And the reporter had put together this questionnaire with a guy named Sir Denison Ross, an Oriental scholar. It was designed to trap the teacher, but he smilingly threaded his way through it without stumbling. Now, this is really interesting. I went over this with my daughter. My daughter's 27, and of course, we've shared stories all our lives. It's the best person for me to talk to about these things, because she knows generally what I'm always talking about, because I've always been talking about these things. So I read to her this because I wanted her to hear the tone that Baba was using in this interview. It's kind of funny. Baba's kind of playing with this person. Okay, now remember, this person has come to try to trick Baba up, and so he's got very tricky answers. And they're true, and they conform with his teaching, but we would have to say a little more about them. This person doesn't know anything about Baba. Now, I want to read a little that shows the tone, the sort of lighthearted tone that Baba's using, even mischievous. Baba, the guy says, he says, the world is perplexed with disaster. This is 1932, so I guess it's the Great Depression and the rise of fascism, maybe. Is there any way out of world crisis? Baba, yes. How long will it last? Only another year. See, only another year. One more year. Baba did write like that sometimes. One more year. But of course, it would go on and on. So it's kind of a joke, unless it's a meaningful joke. 1 year. We're always living in that 1 year. Then there will be recovery and deliverance. So 1934. Then the reporter says, Christ's mission was accomplished in 3 years. How long will your mission last? Baba answers, 33 years. He replied. Now, that's very funny. Because the 33 years, Baba seems to have pulled this out of a hat. But what's the guy going to say? You know, it's just, when I read this to Megan, she says, well, these are kind of silly questions. And so Baba's getting kind of silly answers. But when it comes to evil, I want to get to that part, because that's my point. There's more I could read here to show that there's this tone. Baba's being very funny and fast. But the guy's very pleased at the end of the interview. Very impressed. And but one of the questions meant to trick Baba was, he said, he says, have you solved the problem of evil? And Baba says, there is no evil, he said. There are only degrees of good. And he didn't say relative degrees of good, because that's bad. That's not how you write or speak. He would have done this on his alphabet board. There are only degrees of good. Now that's grammatically better, and that's what he did say. And then the interview goes on after that. But I wanted to point out some things. Megan pointed these out too when we were talking this morning, because or it was last night. I was telling her that I was going to do this talk. And anyway, the point is that, in Christianity they have a problem of evil, and if you look it up, it's mostly a Christian problem, because if God is all these all benevolent, say, and all wise, and all the omnis, then how could he have created a world that has evil in it? It doesn't make sense. It seems like a paradox, or it's a contradiction, and it's attacked all the time by atheists, saying there's a problem here. So that's the problem of evil. So when the guy says, have you solved the problem of evil? Megan points out Baba doesn't have a problem of evil, because he doesn't have that teaching. For Baba, there are 10 states of God, remember? There's not just this benevolent one idea of God, and he's sort of like a sky daddy, and he's real good. I mean, God is in a horse thief and a dog. God is in good things and bad. In that is God that is the self within every self. It's the real self within every self. And that self is looking for perfection. So it's on its way from being quite mixed up like the horse thief or the dog to realizing that his own divinity as a man, finally. A man or a woman, by the way. And so that's that. That's where that comes from. It's not in any book of discourses by Meher Baba. Meher Baba never said there is no such thing as evil, except in that interview. And it was specific. Now, there was, so you kind of have to qualify this. But as Megan points out, for Baba, there's also no such thing as an apple, because that's an illusion. So to say there's no such thing as evil without pointing out that everything's an illusion, that all phenomena, you're really misleading people, because you're making them think, well, there's good, but there's not bad, or something like that. Now let's get to Baba's discourse. Baba's discourse, when I was reading it, see, Baba gives a discourse in his main book, which I have to go over his main books and why they're his main books, but I'll do that another time. But in essence, his most important books are God Speaks and Discourses. And these are the most authoritative, definitive record of what Baba taught, okay? And the Discourses, I have it here. I have a 2000 edition. This it's available on Amazon. It was written it came from a journal that was being kept in the 1930s and into the 40s called the Meher Baba Journal, and then it was assembled in various forms as 5 volumes, and later it's 3 volumes, and then currently it's 1 volume. And that's what I'm using. And I'm using, and in Discourses, there's an article, there's a chapter, which was originally an article in the Meher Baba Journal by Baba, worked up from his notes, as I said, by Deshmukh, who was a philosopher. And it's called Good and Evil. So if somebody says, Baba doesn't teach anything about evil, he doesn't have that concept. Well, I don't know how people miss this stuff, because it's right here. It's on page 61. It's actually quite early in a book that's like 425 pages, so it's on page 61. So it's not at all hard to find. And you can get this free download online of the Discourses. And I'm going to go over this. I made some notes this morning. Now, the first thing I want to say is, well, I guess that's obvious. Obviously, I'm not perfect, so there's no implication here that I have transcended good and evil or something like that, or I'm all good and not bad. I have bad and I have good. And I just wanted to say that because, I'm giving a talk about good and evil. So where do I think I fit in? I think I fit in kind of in the middle with everybody else. But I must say that from Baba's teaching, there are some things that I think it has improved my behavior ethically, because I see all creatures, living creatures, and even inanimate objects, as really God expressing, finding himself. So I'm a vegetarian, for instance. My daughter and I both are. We decided to do that about 20 years ago. And we've been, it's sort of like a little covenant we keep. It's something we share. And that's because we don't like the suffering of animals. And I think that comes from Baba. And Baba himself was vegetarian. Now, and also I would, so there's things like that. I don't want to harm anything. Sometimes it happens and you feel bad. But I would say from Baba's teaching, there are a lot of reasons why I don't. A, I believe in karma, so I believe it'll come back on me. And B, I believe in the divinity of everyone, so I'm really hurting myself and I'm hurting God in them. Even though it's sleeping and dormant, still it's sinful. So the first thing I want to say is that reading Baba and looking for the word evil, you do a search for the word evil, you find Baba using the word evil very comfortably, not going, and there's really no evil. That's not how he writes. He uses the word evil like anybody would. He discusses it. It's something that has to be talked about. And he's not constantly equivocating. And he talks about good, and he talks about the difference between good and evil, and that good is better than evil, and he explains why it's better than evil. And that's where Baba becomes much more complicated, complex, and rich, much richer than anything else I've ever heard on the subject of good and evil. I think it's an incredible discourse. And the reason is that usually you start out talking about evil, kind of like George Bush Jr., well, I know it when I see it. See, there's no taking into account what you perceive. There's no insight into your own interpretation. You just think you're seeing objectively, which is very primitive. As a matter of fact, it's called naive realism. The idea that how you're seeing things is exactly how the world really is, because, I don't know, you're have some deep access. Intelligent people realize that they have to take their own point of view into account when they're looking at something, and realize that they don't have the whole picture. And most discussions of evil start out like we all just know what's bad and what we're even talking about evil, except that Christians will admit, and most people will admit, once they explore it, it's a very hard thing to answer what good is. So we equate it with God, but that's not exactly what Baba does. Baba has a different thing. Now, I realize I might be not speaking very well in this talk, and then that's why I always reserve the right to do it over again. But I'm going to keep going because that's the only way I can learn how I could have done it better. Okay. The first thing is Baba needs, another thing I want to say is Baba has to ride this fine line between the fact that some good and evil is relative to a society or the norms or how you're looking upon something or all the aspects of the context. And yet swinging the old other way, where because of that you just become like a hedonist or a sensualist, that you're just indifferent to good and bad because it's all relative. Baba's not a relativist. A relativist is where it doesn't matter. Baba says of all the opposites in the world of duality, the most spiritually important opposite distinction is that between good and evil. Isn't that interesting? It's not the least important, it's the most important, okay? Now, all this begins on page 61 of this 7th edition, modern version of the Discourses. And it's the chapter of good and evil. And the first thing he says is the mind is constantly experiencing, of course, when you're awake. But more than that, the mind is also, whether it wants to or not, it is always evaluating its experience. And in experience, it judges some things as pleasant and some as unpleasant. And so it usually ascribes those things that are going to be unpleasant or lead to them losing something they desire as evil, and things that are pleasant and that lead to something that them attaining or holding on to some thing they desire, that as good. Well, that's pretty shallow, isn't it? Because from that point of view, a miser would see, nobody finding his gold stash as the highest good. Because that conforms with his desires, and that would be very unpleasant because of his desires. So where do these desires come from? And what from our point of view, we see as pleasant and unpleasant? They come from our sanskars. Now, our sanskars are the impressions left on the mind from past experience. So you'll find people that evaluate things differently. So some people, I, for instance, like cold weather. Most people I talk to like warm weather. But I would much rather, I live in a warm climate place, but it's one of my grievances, is I wish I had lived in a cold climate place, but I'm kind of too old to be moving away now, and I had to raise my daughter. And so your point of view based on your desires is based on your sanskars, which determines your desires. So it's all based on your desires. And yet, it's not all relative. Okay, just saying that much, it's kind of like that relativism. Who's good? Who's right and wrong? Who's truth? Well, there's a bit of that, and Baba is acknowledging that. But there's also an objective kind of good and bad. And that for Baba has to do with his theme. Remember, the theme is that God comes in, has this dream, and in this dream he acquires these sanskars, or kind of like lenses, that color his perception. But this eventually, as a human being, once he's come through evolution, he's acquired all these sanskars, it becomes a kind of trap, a kind of prison. He's sort of like a slave in Plato's cave, tied up facing the screen, and he can't get unbound. And to get unbound, you have to work off those sanskars, okay? And once you do get unbound, you, to quote, I'm going to do it here, I was going to do it later. I'll quote William Blake, who in 1790 wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, a poem. And in it he says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. But we don't see infinite. We see things finitely through these lenses that we've acquired, these conditioning mind that we have that determines whether we see things good or bad. So those things that free us from these sanskars is ultimately really what's good, really good for us, and it's the ultimate good, because the ultimate good is God realization. That's the whole reason that the universe came into existence. And the whole purpose for the illusion is to ultimately, by having all the false answers to the question, who am I, you finally come to the real answer once you see clearly, as Blake says, oh, I am God. I am the creator itself of my own dream. And that is Baba's theme. And therefore, you get it. That which emancipates a human being is what's really good. So, and as you get emancipated, you're losing not just sanskars, but because related to the sanskars is desires, because that's how we experience our sanskars, as our desires. Now, to be desireless is objectively the highest good. Now, he goes into another thing that's harder to understand, and that is that ultimately, we do need, the quest is to go from bad to good, but ultimately we even have to, there is a sense in which we transcend these as illusions too. But it doesn't mean we start by being bad. And I'm going to get into this in the second part, because I'm at 27 minutes, and my tape runs out at 29 minutes or something. So I'm going to stop now and continue in a moment. Okay. Now, let me explain this part. Baba has that the journey of the soul is one that has to first, before you become human, you have to traverse all the stages of evolution, because that's how you acquire full consciousness. As you start as a rock and a worm and a bird and a fish, a fish and a bird and a mammal, and you come up through evolution until you finally become a human being, in which you now are an ethical creature, and you have to assess these things intelligently, and then ultimately, find some spiritual advice and so forth. But when you first become a human being after this journey, as all these animals and things, you have acquired a lot of bad habits, you could say. It's sort of like you have photos stored up in your subconscious of all these very ferocious, scary, terrible things. They weren't terrible when you were in evolution so much because they were natural. They had to do them. But life is eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. You got to be selfish to survive in the jungle, because if you don't, you're not going to make it. So you come out of that as a human being essentially kind of bad. All right? Basically, it's much easier to be bad than it is to be good. That's how a person starts out with their human lives, which are many, okay? And then he has to try to work his way from bad to good. But let me get to, I hope I can find this now quickly. And he says, there is always, he's talking about how everyone is really God-seeking himself. Everybody is redeemable. So even a person who has become very good, they only became good because they experienced what it was to be bad at one time. And they've learned from that wasn't what they wanted to do. And and then every sinner, of course, is tomorrow's saint. So we try to look upon people that way and not judge them forever. Essentially, it's the Christian idea of redemption. Everybody is capable of seeing the error of their ways and becoming better. But there's always, that's the context of this sentence, there is always hope for everyone. No one is utterly lost, and none need despair. It remains true, however, that the way to divinity lies through the renunciation of evil in favor of good. All right? So it's a very important thing. We're moving, Baba has a line, from good to God, okay? Then there's an aspect where you can overshoot and become such a goody-goody, your ego can get attached to it as a more saintly person. Now, everybody knows this. Everybody has seen people like this, who are sort of like church lady or something. And Baba talks about this, and this is where they need to have the insight to see that their ego is getting attached to good, because good is just as seductive as bad, and in a way more. Because when I see that I was, bad, and I'm sitting there and it just hits me, and I have insight. I mean, it's not hard for me to let go of that, because who wants to be that, really? Even bank robbers believe that they're really the good guy. There's a funny line in the computer game Grand Theft Auto where the bank robber says that to his son, because his son says, "You're a terrible guy, Dad." And he goes, "Yeah, well, I guess I've been all those things, but I always thought I was the good guy." So we all want to be good. So it's actually, once you become good after many, many, many lives of working on becoming better and having then you can get attached to that, because, well, see, it's very seductive. See, so so at the very end, you have a kind of pendulum where you don't want to be good can overrun bad, and then you can become trapped in that. So you really want to get to where you're in balance, because ultimately you want to have this whole illusion to go away. Now, you want to wipe clean the whole slate and see things as reality, and that's how Baba ends up the discourse, is that ultimately you see the soul, and then that's not even the end, and eventually you become, soul is God, and then eventually you become God. And now, is God beyond good and evil, like Nietzsche says? No, really, God is the ultimate good, and God is infinitely benevolent, Baba says. And the way Saint Augustine, accounted for that was that if you could see things from God's point of view, from all the way back, really see the big picture, which we can't, everything would seem perfect because it's from God. And I think that that's true. And even these missteps along the road that we make to becoming better and better, they have a beauty to them. I'm not saying evil is a beauty to it, although from a high enough perspective, it has its purpose, and it serves its purpose to reform the sinner. And anyway, so he gets to that point where, remember, the ego can get attached even more easily to good than to bad, so we have to watch for that, and then ultimately these balance. But usually the goal isn't reached when people balance good and bad. When you get closer to balancing head and heart, and you sort of start to be more detached from the world and stop judging everything, you find a master, and the master frees you from your last sin scars. So it's not really that you get them in balance through yogas, but you could do that, I guess. But Baba's teaching elsewhere is that ultimately you need to find a master who helps you to obtain realization, and he could give it to you in a snap, or eye contact, or even from across the world when you're ready. As they say, when the student is ready, the teacher comes. Anyway, that is that. I hope I did an okay job. I might redo this. I don't know. It's a hard subject to talk about. Okay. That's part 16. I'll see you in part 17. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.